Ben, thank you for taking the time out.
Oh, my pleasure, Steve.
Glad Mate, I follow you around the world. I'm like a groupie. What do they call that? I'm like, Ben speaking. Got to go to America. Sorry, why are you going to America again, hubby? Oh, Ben speaking. I got to go. You're at the forefront. You're in the lab. You're the one providing the evidence for lots of things I love to talk about. But then you also have this sensational way of putting it across that we can actually understand what you're talking about.
That's great. I'm truly appreciative of that. When I first became a professor, it was a delightful challenge to try to find a way to convey potentially complicated ideas, not only in a way that is accessible and understandable, but also palatable and enjoyable. I am the director of the Metabolism Research Lab at Brigham Young University, and I greatly enjoyed that role of my profession, because that's not the same thing as being a professor. There's a professor and then there's a scientist. I have the great joy of being both, which isn't uncommon, but they're not the same thing. My lab does focus generally on the metabolic origins of disease. That would perhaps be the simplest way of describing it. But in saying that, people would hear the metabolism, the metabolic part, and come to their own conclusions. That word can mean so many different things. So to be very precise, it is most explicitly a lab that focuses on insulin resistance, where it comes from, and why it's a problem. So a lot of the recent work we've done is identifying the role of some of our bigger publications recently, the role of insulin resistance in brain neurological mitochondrial disruption, or a state where the neurons of the brain are becoming insulin resistant and thereby being deprived of nutrient or energy, and then contributing to a disease. And most clearly, we were studying Alzheimer's disease. So this was viewed in the context of Alzheimer's. So that's the lab. And you had mentioned touching on the insulin resistance part. I can't say this enough. Insulin resistance is invoked sometimes improperly, and then it's just misunderstood what it is. There needs to be two parts to this. This is a two-part pathology, or a coin with two sides. Everyone appreciates the first side of the coin, which is that insulin isn't working well at certain cells of the body. Now, that is not a universal phenomenon within the body. Some cells of the body are responding fine to insulin. Some aren't. But those former cells that are responding fine are put in a very difficult position when we flip this coin over and look at the other side of what we're calling insulin resistance. The other side of this, the essential second part, is the hyperinsulinemia. And now you then have a state where some of the cells of the body aren't responding well to insulin, some are responding very well. Those that are responding very well are now inundated or excessively activated because of the chronically elevated levels of insulin. That is itself driving pathology, even separate from the the altered insulin responsiveness at some of the cells. Like, for example, a very quick example is infertility. The most common forms of infertility are PCOS in women and erectile dysfunction in men. Both of them are heavily, if almost totally, caused by insulin resistance. Where the earliest manifestation was the ED, then it was the hypertension, where the problem starts to get more systemic, and then finally it was the outright diabetes. And then underlying all of this, of course, had been this, if we had had a clinical perspective that included insulin, it would have been detected. Insulin is the canary in the coal mine. It is the early signal that ends up warning, whistling out the tune that there's a problem and we need to be paying attention now before these other more chronic issues settle in. Now, the good news, the gospel of metabolism, is that you are never too far gone.
Yes.
In a general sense, maybe your diabetes has been so bad you've lost some toes or something. That's, of course, gone. But everything else can start to be corrected and reversed, and not even slowly. This is something that can happen within weeks, within 90 days. A paper that we'd published, we were able to reverse every instance of type 2 diabetes without ever a single pill popped or a single syringe injected.
But Swiss Re, which is one of the biggest life insurance companies in Europe, have copied. I'm going to call it our tree because all the ideas were yours. I just made the graphics, you know. And Swiss Re have started sending it to their clients.
Well, John and the team there I just could not be happier with his, particularly his efforts, and I admire what he's trying to do. Because if we can get insurers who start embracing this view, then we're set.
Yeah.
Because they will then help dictate, in part, that might be an indelicate way of saying it, the clinical perspective. And then if clinicians are enabled to do this, if a clinician is enabled to measure insulin and they even hear about it from an insurer, they're going to do it.
Yeah.
It's not like a clinician is some malicious figure who doesn't want to include this marker. They either don't know about it, which is very common as a clinical marker of importance here, or two, even if they do know, they know that there's no way they can feasibly fit it within the system, whether it's the U.S. system, the NHS, Switzerland, it doesn't matter. There are barriers to simply getting that hormone measured.
Yeah.
But if an insurer is able to step in and start doing that, that starts to change the game.
There's barriers, there's time. Because even though we know the 5 measurements, 6 measurements that you need that can indicate whether you're insulin resistant, you've then got to translate that in a 10-minute appointment in the GP. When Ben says clinician, we think GP in the UK, general practitioner. And also lack of knowledge. I've said this a few times, and I'm not having a go at doctors. I love doctors. Most of my friends are doctors.
I'll tell you, it becomes a vicious cycle. There's no other way to view it. The moment you start putting a type 2 diabetic on insulin therapy, you are accelerating their demise. You are making them get fatter more quickly, and you are driving chronic disease more quickly. They literally die faster. The risk of cardiovascular death from heart disease goes up by 3 times.
It's in the book. Yep.
You're literally killing them faster.
I showed my dad the page.
But the vicious cycle is now you are on the chronic too high, too low cycle that typically only plagues a type 1 diabetic, mind you, only when they're eating a high-carb diet, because we give them this asinine advice, which is eat whatever you want, eat all the carbs you want, just cover it with insulin. If you have been diagnosed with diabetes, type 1 or type 2, the one thing they have in common is the high glucose. They're exact opposites when it comes to insulin, whereas a type 1 diabetic is an insufficiency of insulin. A type 2 diabetic is an excess. It's not working. And so you've heard me use the analogy before, but for those who haven't, giving a type 2 diabetic insulin is like giving an alcoholic another glass of wine. You're giving the person more of the very thing that's driving the problem.
Yeah.
If giving an alcoholic another glass of wine isn't going to solve the alcoholism, so too is giving a type 2 diabetic an insulin injection not going to help the disease. You're continuing it. You're feeding the beast. But that puts the person on this roller coaster of highs and lows in glucose, and they're given the advice to make sure you eat carbs to cover your insulin injection. No. They have too much insulin in the first place. Diabetes is a disease of poorly metabolizing glucose.
Yep.
Why on earth, to put it very politely and diplomatically, would we tell them to eat more glucose? That's the one thing they're struggling with.
Yeah.
The disease isn't defined by high blood triglycerides, thus why should there be a fear of fat? The disease isn't defined by high blood levels of amino acids, thus why should there be a fear of protein? It is defined by elevated glucose. Why then does that continue to be the nutrient that is most embraced by conventional dietetic dogma?
Yeah.
It defies all logic.
Yeah.
And there must be some other reason that only leads us into very cynical, dark pathways and conclusions and vested interests.
Ken Berry said it brilliantly yesterday. He said, maybe we just need to rename type 2 diabetes to carbohydrate intoxicity syndrome.
That's good. Yeah, call it a glucose or a glucotoxicity.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a much more accurate view. In fact, I think us putting together type 1 and type 2 in the same family of diabetes was the first problem. They should not be considered similar pathologies. They're totally different. The fact that they have one thing in common, namely the high glucose, why should that then lead us to considering that they should have similar treatments? They are really diseases of total opposites. And in this massive Venn diagram, the one single touch point is the high glucose. To hell with all of the other differences, which are extreme different ends. One is obese, one is very lean, one is high insulin, one is a total deficiency of insulin. One cannot burn fat, the other can't stop burning fat. They're exact opposites.
Yeah.
The one thing they have high glucose, and that's the reason we use to justify the treatments. No, it doesn't make sense.
As simple to start off with as reducing the carbs?
That's a great question. Yes, it is. Now that this is a multifaceted approach. I often will discuss an insulin sensitizing journey. One way I've learned to discuss it is a fat cell shrinking journey, because as you touch on in the book, It's not the mass of fat that matters most. It's the size of each individual fat cell. So that's how we should look at it. I think that helps us understand the real origins here in a chronic insulin-resistant state. It's not as much a matter of losing fat, although that will be the obvious effect. It's that you look at you imagine each fat cell and think, I need to shrink that. There are two primary ways to do that: low calorie and low insulin. Both of those will work. This is why you can take someone who adopts a vegan diet, a profoundly nutrient deficient way of living life and eating, and they can improve their type 2 diabetes and their insulin resistance because they've cut their calories so much.
Yep.
They're essentially just going into this weird fast, eventually leading to nutrient deficiencies. Alternatively, you have a low insulin approach. Now, both of those will work. The reason I am so heavy-handed about the insulin lowering approach is because we see what happens if a person's fat cell shrinking journey starts with the low calorie step. They will in short order take that foot back.
Yes.
They will go right back to where they started. Because if you cut calories, but your insulin is still elevated, and that hasn't been addressed, insulin is going to want to be telling all calories in the blood. Insulin abhors energy not being stored in a cell. And so its thematic effect from top to bottom will be to tell nutrients to be stored and locked away in cells. That works perfectly fine for liver, which has an abundant energy supply. Fat cells have an abundant energy supply. Even muscle cells have a lot of glycogen and fat. The brain has no capacity to store energy. Thus, it must constantly rely on the energy that comes from the blood. So if insulin's high but calories coming in is down, then the overall nutrient availability in the blood has gone down. David Ludwig has shown this. Total energy availability in a high insulin state goes down. The brain senses this relative reduction in energy in the blood, whether it's glucose or fats or whatever it would want to be sensing, ketones. It will then say, well, we need to eat because energy is going down. Little knowing that the fat cells, the liver, the muscle, they're all perfectly fed.
Can't get to it.
Yes, it's just, it doesn't know. It can only rely on the energy in the blood, and thus its solution to this is hunger.
Yeah.
And so that is why every approach that starts with eat less, exercise more, which is the perfect manifestation of the calorie-based view, which again is real. It works. If you cut calories, it will work. The reason I cannot embrace that view, however, is because, as I said, that approach leads to hunger.
Yep.
And so rather than doom yourself to failure and immediately invite misery by cutting calories but not addressing your insulin, flip those around.
Yeah.
Let your calories be what they may, and if you bring down your insulin, now you will increase your metabolic rate by 200 to 300 calories a day. You'll start making ketones, which will satiate the brain, and the brain will be thinking, hey, we're all good here. There's plenty of energy.
Yep.
Let's maybe stop eating, and you'll finally be burning all the fat that you've been storing. When I was describing the bodybuilders who are during this very low-calorie cutting phase, they've been bulking, now they need to cut and get super lean. Every one of them will document the one thing they will say is that they have an obsession with food. They think about food 24/7. Talk to any celebrity who's had to lose a substantial amount of weight for a role. They will say, I was obsessed with food. It was a constant preoccupation. A bodybuilder or a movie star with this full team and millions of dollars on the line, they will have a motivation that the average individual will not. While they can get through with just sheer grit and determination that phase and a lot of help, the average individual will not.
Yeah.
Myself included. I don't mean to cast aspersions on anyone else.
Yeah.
I couldn't do this.
Yeah.
You will fail. It requires a level of just sheer grit and determination and discipline that I'm not ashamed to say I don't have, and most people don't either. It's basically like you have bandoliers of energy bars and energy drinks, and you can never open them. I look at where I live in Utah, up in the mountains. It's very common for people to go on hikes. I have a sort of a dark humor when I see these obese individuals starting a 2 or 3 mile hike, and they have a fanny pack of energy bars and little energy goos that you see people take during marathons and triathlons. And I think to myself, you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of calories stored on your body waiting to be burned. And ironically, you're adding to your mass burden on this hike by taking more calories with you. Imagine that's the poor metabolic flexibility or the metabolic inflexibility that's been identified over the years, where essentially they're stuck burning glucose. And nowadays, people in social media always want to invoke the Randall cycle, this idea of, well, the cell can't burn both fat and glucose at the same time. Well, yeah, of course it can't. You need one primary energy source at any given moment because it's competing for the same biochemical pathways. And people want to invoke the Randle cycle as if they're kind of clever. The Randle cycle is simply stated the phenomenon that a cell will burn either glucose or fat primarily at any given moment. Mm-hmm. Well, guess who decides which one it burns? They want to say that it's all a matter of what's available. No, it's not. No, don't tell me that, because then why is a type 1 diabetic who skips their insulin injections, they have a glucose level of, I'll invoke millimolar for the local audience, 15 millimolar, which is 4 times too high, and yet they cannot stop burning fat? And you're telling me that it's all a matter of what's available? No, I just proved you wrong. It's insulin. It's hormones that tell the body, that tell the cells what energy to burn. Yes, the human metabolic machine is a hybrid. It's a genius thing, relying on either glucose or fats. It's insulin that tells the cell what to burn. Insulin is what tells every cell of the body what to do with the energy that it has. And maybe just to put the cherry on top of that statement, in my lab at BYU right now, we have an incubator that's growing all kinds of cells, including fat cells. As just a funny point of irony, it is very hard to grow fat cells in a culture dish, in a petri dish, whereas we can grow muscle cells like weeds. Really? The fat cells are stubbornly difficult things to grow. They need a perfect kind of cocktail of molecules in order to be told it's time to get fat. We will have the fat cells growing in this dish, swimming in a bath of calories. They have all the energy they need. And
so
yet
you've got the fat cell surrounded with sugar.
Sugar and fats. All the fuel a fat cell would ever want.
This is going where I'm thinking it's
going.
Yeah,
and yet they don't grow. We're looking at them day after day. I'll have my student looking at them. Dr. Bickman, they're not growing. I'll say, yes, because they don't know yet what to do. Every cell wants to play nicely with the organism. A fat cell doesn't know what's happening at a muscle cell. It doesn't know that we're up and running. How would it know that? It's not running. It's not doing any more work than it ever was. It has to be told what to do. Insulin tells the cell what to do, especially the fat cell. And indeed, the moment we start sprinkling in a little insulin into that bath, check those cells 24 hours later, all of a sudden they have a substantial lipid droplet, or they're a chubby cell. Check it 24 hours again, they're even bigger than before. Deprive the insulin, give it a day, and they're all shrunk back down to normal.
Wow.
A cell must be told what to do with the energy that it has. But in that example, some people who are probably straw manning the view here will say, well, Ben thinks it's only about insulin. No, I've invoked calories as well. Calories matter, but so too does the insulin. In fact, I would even say especially so. Yeah. Because again, if your paradigm is based, if your fat cell shrinking journey is a calorie-based view or strategy, yeah, you'll get a little bit down that pathway, but in short order, you'll be right back at the front.
Yep.
Because most people cannot get through that hunger without stumbling. So don't even worry about that. Don't take that calorie step. Let calories be what they may.
Yep.
Let the first step be controlling insulin. And then eventually, you will lose weight. The fat cells will be shrinking. You'll be relying on your own fat for energy. And then you may find that you've plateaued and you still have more to go. Now you're in a very good position to take that other step of addressing calories, but not by counting calories, not by reducing fat. It is by frequently fasting.
Yep.
Now you're in a position to have a structured fast and let that be the mechanism whereby you address the energy part of it. For me, my pillars: control carbs,
number one,
with focus on fiber. Prioritize protein. Don't fear fat. And then frequently fast. I put that at the end on purpose. In fact, even when I present it, will have it separated from the others. Because if you can go through managing your macros first, remember alliteration, I love it. Manage macros, and then that will help the body get into that metabolic milieu that we were discussing before, where you're now relying on your own energy. Then you can engage in frequent fasting. But even still, as much as I'm an advocate of frequent fasting and fasting in general, how you end a fast is more important than how long you fast. Too often, people use a fast as a form of a binge purge cycle. And then they're doomed. They're dooming themselves, which is sort of what you're describing. If they just jump into a fast, they're not ready, but they just through some degree of grit are getting through their 24 hours, and then they binge. They overeat. They feel sick. They feel shamed. And there's this determination, and they say, tomorrow I'm going to do it again, and I'm going to do it better tomorrow. And they end up doing the same thing. So before anyone even thinks about going onto these fasts, Manage your macros first.
Yeah.
Start by controlling your carbs. Let your body learn to burn its own fat for fuel, and you'll find you'll get ready for some fasting. But even still, have a very precise plan in place where you know that when you are going to eat, you've managed your macros. That's what you're going to eat.
One day you're going to wake up and go, oh my God, I didn't have breakfast.
Yes.
And I wasn't hungry.
Exactly.
I wasn't hungry.
That's exactly right. And so it's the exact opposite of the low-calorie approach, where you become obsessive about food. Whereas with the low-insulin approach, you find that you just don't care. You don't think about it as much. Yeah. But just speaking, a humorous thing for me as a university professor and a metabolic scientist, looking at all of the unrest that's happening on college campuses in the U.S. at this moment, right now, some of these students have been saying, we're going on a 24-hour hunger strike. And it's like it's a substantial burden that, can you believe it, we're going to go on a 24-hour hunger strike. And I'm so amused that to them, they are thinking this is some remarkable feat.
But it is to them.
Oh, well, and unfortunately it is to the university administrators, too, who just continue to pat these little knuckleheads on their head. But yeah, it's very amusing to me, where I think, go ahead, knock yourself out. Yeah, maybe with some ketones, you'll get a little bit of clarity.
If you'd have told me that,
incredible.
If you'd have told me that when I was obese, I'd have gone, that's impossible. I can't go one meal with that. Then I did the London Marathon 2 years ago after a 9-day total fast and ran completely fasted.
That's incredible.
But you know, no, you're just saying that because you know it's not incredible. Because you also know that.
But I very much appreciate the feat. That's what I mean.
Yeah,
but it is a testament to just how much energy even a lean body has. Yeah. You're a lean guy, and you still have hundreds of thousands of calories stored on you.
Exactly.
And when you consider an obese person, they've literally gotten into the millions.
Yeah.
They have millions of calories just waiting to be burned, and yet we never let them, because if insulin's high, it stays in place.